For centuries, we only had portraits and autopsy reports. The portraits were flattering lies, commissioned by the very people they depicted, painted by artists whose salaries depended on making the king look like a king. The autopsy reports were 17th-century guesswork, written by physicians who still blamed demons and bad humors for disease they couldn't explain. But starting in 2009, a team of geneticists at the University of Santiago de Compostela in Spain began doing something nobody had seriously attempted before. They took the Hapsburgs' own obsessively maintained royal genealogies, thousands of individuals across 20 generations, documented with fanatical precision for dynastic purposes, and they fed them through modern population genetics software. They recruited 10 maxillofacial surgeons to clinically diagnose the faces in Velázquez portraits. They cross-referenced everything against 21st-century medical knowledge, and what they reconstructed wasn't just the jaw. The jaw was the symptom. The underlying genetic damage was catastrophic, reaching into hormones, kidneys, bones, and body systems the Habsburgs didn't even know they had. Now, here's something I need to be straight about, because this is a science story, and the science has to be right. Nobody has cracked open a Hapsburg coffin and sequenced an ancient royal genome. That study doesn't exist. Not yet. What does exist is something arguably more clever. A trio of Spanish researchers who spent over a decade building the most comprehensive genetic analysis of any royal dynasty in history. They didn't need a single bone. They reverse-engineered the genetic catastrophe using math, medicine, and court paintings. And their findings, published across multiple peer-reviewed journals, are genuinely worse than anything the portraits showed. Meet the team. Gonzalo Alvarez, senior professor of genetics, a population geneticist who approached dead kings the same way you'd approach any dataset with a known pedigree. Francisco C. Ceballos, biologist, PhD from Santiago de Compostela, the computational specialist who built the genealogical models making everything else possible. And Roman Vilas, co-lead on the jaw study, the geneticist who helped turn court paintings into clinical diagnostics. As El País reported in December 2019, Ceballos and Alvarez had spent more than a decade analyzing the House of Habsburg. No other research group in the world has matched that level of sustained obsession with one family's DNA. Their first bombshell landed in April 2009. Published in PLOS One under the title, The Role of Inbreeding in the Extinction of a European Royal Dynasty, the study wasn't about the jaw at all. It was about death. The team constructed a genealogy of over 3,000 individuals across 16 generations of the Spanish Habsburg line. Then they calculated something called the inbreeding coefficient for every single monarch. This number, symbolized as F, measures the probability that any given gene in your body was inherited identically from both parents through a shared ancestor. Think of it as a score for how genetically redundant you are. An F of 0 means your parents shared no common ancestry, completely outbred, genetic fresh air. An F of 0.0625 means your parents were first cousins. You've got a 1 in 16 chance that any given gene is a duplicate from the same ancestor. Doesn't sound catastrophic, right? But here's what the number doesn't tell you on its own. It's not about one gene. It's about all of them. Across your entire genome, that probability plays out thousands of times simultaneously. At F equals 0.0625, you'll have some genes where both copies are identical. Most are fine. Some aren't. You can probably absorb the damage. Your body has redundancy built in. But what happens when F doesn't stop at 0.0625? What happens when it keeps climbing, generation after generation? Because every single marriage in your family pulls from the same shrinking genetic pool. Quick crash course on why this mechanism is so devastating. Because without it, the rest of the story is just a list of diseases. Every person alive carries thousands of slightly broken genes, recessive mutations that never cause problems because you inherited a working copy from your other parent. The good copy compensates. You never know the broken one exists. But when both your parents descended from the same ancestor, which is exactly what happens in cousin marriages, uncle-niece marriages, the whole Habsburg playbook, you can inherit 2 broken copies and 0 backup. 2 bad copies, no rescue. That's homozygosity for a deleterious recessive allele, and it is the molecular mechanism by which inbreeding kills. So watch the numbers climb. Philip the Handsome, who founded the Spanish Habsburg line through his 1496 marriage to Joanna of Castile, carried an F of roughly 0.025. Low, unremarkable. His son, Charles V, 0.037. Philip II, 0.042. Still manageable. These were men who functioned, governed, waged wars, but the ratchet was already turning. The dynasty's marriage strategy was strangling its own gene pool. Uncle-niece marriages, first-cousin marriages, marriages between people who were already related through 5, 10, 15 different ancestral pathways. Each generation's inbreeding built on the last generation's homozygosity in a ratchet effect with no release valve. The coefficients climbed with each successive reign. The jaws crept forward in the portraits. The lower lips thickened. The features softened in ways that painters couldn't entirely disguise. Children kept dying, and each death carried the same cruel irony. The marriages designed to secure the dynasty's future were the very thing destroying it. The Hapsburgs weren't being punished by God. They were being punished by adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. 4 molecules arranging themselves into patterns that had been narrowing for generations. And then came the last of the line. Charles, born on November 6, 1661, in Madrid. Inbreeding coefficient, 0.254. Let that number sit. The child of first cousins carries an F of 0.0625. The child of a brother and sister carries an F of 0.25. Charles II, whose parents were technically uncle and niece, was genetically equivalent to the product of incest. His mother, Mariana of Austria, connected to his father, Philip IV, through at least 189 distinct genealogical pathways. The software essentially treated them as closer than siblings. The family tree wasn't a tree anymore. It was a wreath. But the truly devastating finding from the 2009 study wasn't the coefficients themselves. Historians had estimated those before. It was what Alvarez and his team did next. They correlated inbreeding coefficients with infant and child mortality across the entire dynasty and found a clean, dose-dependent relationship. More inbreeding, more death. A straight statistical line. Inbreeding reduced offspring survival by up to 18%. Roughly half of all infant deaths in the Spanish Habsburg line were attributable directly to the genetic consequences of consanguinity. Half. Children were dying generation after generation, and the Hapsburgs, blinded by political logic and theological conviction, never saw the pattern. They blamed God. They blamed witchcraft. They blamed the mothers. They never blamed the marriages. Then came the jaw study. Published in December 2019 in the Annals of Human Biology, Ceballos, Vilas, Alvarez, and the team tackled the most famous face in European history. Their methodology was brilliantly simple and brutally rigorous. They assembled 66 portraits of 15 Habsburg dynasty members. Then they recruited 10 maxillofacial surgeons, specialists who diagnose and treat jaw disorders for a living, and asked each surgeon to independently score every portrait for 11 specific features of facial dysmorphology. Not art critics, not historians, surgeons. Those 11 features were clinical diagnostic markers, including mandibular prognathism, the forward protrusion of the lower jaw, and maxillary deficiency, the underdevelopment of the upper jaw. Each surgeon scored each portrait independently, without consulting the others. Then the team aggregated those scores and correlated the facial dysmorphology scores against the known inbreeding coefficients for each individual. The result was unambiguous. Both mandibular prognathism and maxillary deficiency increased in direct proportion to the inbreeding coefficient. The higher the F, the worse the face. And here's something most people get wrong about the Habsburg jaw. It wasn't one deformity. It was two. Two distinct anatomical problems, both getting worse with each generation. Both statistically correlated with inbreeding, but likely operating through different genetic mechanisms. The famous Habsburg face wasn't just a big lower jaw. It was a big lower jaw crashing into a shrunken upper jaw, and the gap between them widened with every consanguineous marriage. Think about what that actually means for a living person. Not cosmetically, functionally. Your teeth don't align. Chewing food is a daily ordeal. You can't grind properly, so you swallow half-chewed pieces that your stomach struggles to process. Your airway is compromised because the upper jaw helps form the floor of the nasal cavity, and when it's underdeveloped, the passage narrows. Sleep apnea, chronic mouth breathing, speech impairment, because the tongue can't sit properly against a jaw that's the wrong shape. Chronic dental infections from misaligned, overcrowded teeth pressing into gums at angles nature never intended. This isn't vanity. This is a face that can't perform its basic biological functions. But the jaw was just the door. The Santiago de Compostela team walked through it into something much darker. They took every documented symptom from Charles II's life, the ambassadorial dispatches, the court physician's bewildered notes, the letters from foreign diplomats who reported on the king's condition with a mixture of pity and political alarm, and systematically matched those symptoms against the modern medical literature on autosomal recessive disorders, the exact category of genetic conditions made dramatically more probable by an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254. Their conclusion was devastating. Charles II most likely suffered from not one, but two simultaneous autosomal recessive disorders: combined pituitary hormone deficiency and distal renal tubular acidosis. Together, these two conditions explain virtually every symptom contemporaries documented, from his catastrophic childhood through his death at 38. This wasn't a wild guess. It was a differential diagnosis that considered and eliminated numerous candidate disorders and arrived at the only combination covering the full constellation of his afflictions. Most documentaries would stop here. Name the conditions, move on. We're not doing that. Because clinical names are just labels until you understand what they do to a body that has to live inside them. Combined pituitary hormone deficiency, CPHD, means the pituitary gland, a pea-sized organ at the base of your brain that acts as the body's master hormonal switchboard, fails to produce multiple critical hormones. In severe autosomal recessive forms, typically caused by mutations in genes like PROP1 or POU1F1 that encode transcription factors essential for pituitary development during fetal life, the gland simply never forms properly. Growth hormone production drops or stops. Thyroid-stimulating hormone vanishes. Gonadotropins, the hormones driving sexual development and fertility, never arrive. ACTH, which controls your adrenal stress response, falls silent. When both copies of the responsible gene are broken, a scenario made terrifyingly probable by Charles's F of 0.254, you're born with a switchboard missing most of its circuits. Here's what that does to a human being. You're cold, all the time. Without thyroid hormone, your metabolism runs slow, your body temperature drops, your cognition blurs, thoughts arrive late and degraded, like a signal fighting through static. Your muscles are weak and wasted, not from laziness, from the absence of growth hormone, which your body needs throughout life to maintain and repair muscle tissue. Getting out of bed is a negotiation with a body that doesn't want to move. Without ACTH, your adrenal glands can't mount a proper stress response. Any illness, any physical exertion, any emotional shock could trigger an adrenal crisis, a life-threatening collapse of blood pressure and blood sugar. In a modern emergency room, they'd hit you with intravenous cortisol. In 1680s Madrid, they'd call a priest, maybe an exorcist. They actually did call exorcists for a hormonal disorder. And without gonadotropins, your sexual organs never fully developed. You have the reproductive capacity of a child and no way to explain why. Now, imagine you're Charles II, King of Spain. Every court in Europe is watching. The single thing your existence must justify, the one duty that eclipses governing, diplomacy, everything, is producing an heir. You married Marie-Louise of Orléans in 1679. No children. She died in 1689. You married Mariana of Neuburg. No children. Foreign ambassadors are writing coded dispatches to their capitals speculating about your capabilities in the bedroom. Your court physicians are baffled. Your advisors are frantic. And you can't explain what's wrong because you don't understand it yourself. Your body simply never received the chemical signal to become reproductively functional. The autopsy performed after your death on November 1st, 1700, would describe a single testicle, black as coal, consistent with severe atrophy from lifelong gonadotropin deprivation. But you don't know any of that. Nobody does. Not for another 3 centuries. Now, layer the second disorder on top. Distal renal tubular acidosis, DRTA, means the distal tubules in your kidneys lose their ability to excrete hydrogen ions into urine. The autosomal recessive form, caused by mutations in genes like ATP6V1B1, ATP6V0A4, or SLC4A1, encoding the molecular acid pumps, is the severe form. The form consanguinity favors. When these pumps fail, acid accumulates in your blood. Your body enters chronic metabolic acidosis, a chemical emergency that never resolves and never relents. What does that feel like? Your body, desperate to buffer excess acid, starts cannibalizing its own skeleton. Calcium and phosphate leach from your bones in a continuous chemical trade-off. Survival now, structural collapse later. This is osteomalacia, deep, aching bone pain in your legs, pelvis, lower back. Not sharp enough to localize, but pervasive enough to make every position uncomfortable. You shift and nothing helps. Meanwhile, all that calcium flooding through your kidneys precipitates into stones and crystalline deposits. Nephrocalcinosis, calcification of the kidney tissue itself. You pass kidney stones that cause blinding flank pain and bloody urine. You're nauseated much of the time. You vomit frequently. You can't keep food down. And remember, you already can't chew properly because of the jaw. So malnutrition compounds from both ends. You can't eat, and what you do eat, your kidneys sabotage. In children, untreated DRTA causes failure to thrive. The child doesn't grow, doesn't gain weight, doesn't develop, and no amount of feeding helps. Because the problem isn't in the stomach. It's in the kidneys. Now hold both conditions in your mind simultaneously. One body. A person who is hypothyroid, growth hormone deficient, adrenally insufficient, hypogonadal, chronically acidotic, calcium depleted, kidney damaged, and malnourished from a jaw malformation that makes chewing a daily battle. That person isn't merely sickly. That person is experiencing systemic organ failure in slow motion, propped on a throne, asked to govern an empire, expected to produce an heir. Every system in the body props up every other system. When multiple systems fail at once, the effects don't add, they multiply. Thyroid fatigue compounds the muscle weakness from growth hormone deficiency, which compounds the bone pain from osteomalacia, which compounds the nausea from acidosis, which compounds the malnutrition from the jaw, which circles back and worsens everything else in a feedback loop that has no bottom. Charles wasn't experiencing one disease with many symptoms. He was experiencing the convergence of multiple rare diseases in a body that had no capacity to compensate for any of them, because the same genetic mechanism that caused one disorder also caused the others. Contemporary accounts describe a man who couldn't walk until roughly age 4, who drooled constantly, whose tongue appeared too large for his mouth, though modern interpretation suggests it was a normal tongue trapped in a severely malformed jaw with nowhere to go. A man who couldn't chew food, whose speech was difficult to understand, who looked elderly by his early 30s, who suffered episodes of hematuria, blood in the urine. Diplomats who met him wrote home with barely concealed horror. That famous autopsy? It reported his body contained not a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous, his head full of water, one testicle black as coal. 17th-century autopsy technique was crude, and some of this was surely exaggeration or metaphorical description passed off as clinical observation. But read it through the lens of CPhD and DRTA, and the picture snaps into focus with startling clarity. The fluid in his skull could indicate hydrocephalus, which can accompany pituitary developmental abnormalities. The kidney stones found during autopsy are classic DRTA, and the descriptions of organ failure are consistent with a body whose immune system, compromised by profound hormonal deficiency and chronic illness, finally succumbed to cascading infections it could no longer fight. The autopsy wasn't fiction. It was a 17th-century physician accurately describing what he saw and having no framework whatsoever to explain it. And that's the real point of the Santiago de Compostela research. Not that the Hapsburgs were inbred. Everyone already knew that. Not that Charles II was sick. The portraits made that obvious even through layers of deliberate flattery. The point is that 21st century genetics can now name the specific molecular catastrophes that inbreeding produced, can trace the path from a marriage contract signed in a palace to a broken Prop 1 gene, to a pituitary gland that never formed, to a king who couldn't produce an heir, despite the fate of a dynasty depending on it. The vague, hand-wavy, inbreeding is bad has been replaced with a precise clinical diagnosis. 2 disorders, named genes, known mechanisms, predicted symptoms that match the historical record with eerie accuracy. Charles II died on November 1st, 1700, 5 days before his 39th birthday. He left no heir. And that absence, that empty cradle, that failure of one man's broken pituitary to produce a single viable child, extinguished the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. That's the scale of what consanguinity did. Not just a deformed jaw in a portrait, not just a sickly king in a palace. A cascade of broken genes producing broken hormones, producing broken organs, producing a broken succession that ended a dynasty which had dominated European politics for 2 centuries. The Habsburgs didn't just harm themselves. Their genetic collapse became a catastrophe that rippled far beyond the palace walls. And the researchers in Santiago de Compostela didn't just tell a story about dead kings, they built a framework that's still being used. The methodologies from the 2009 and 2019 studies are now applied to modern populations where consanguinity remains common. Many parts of the world where consanguineous marriage is culturally practiced. The Habsburg data helps calibrate models predicting how quickly deleterious recessive alleles accumulate in closed populations. Geneticists studying those living communities are building on frameworks that were tested first on Spanish monarchs. 3 centuries after the last Habsburg king stopped breathing, his family's data is still contributing to science. The portraits were propaganda. The autopsy reports were primitive, but the math doesn't lie. And it took 21st century science to finally read what was written in the Hapsburgs' genes all along. Not just a jutting jaw, but a cascade of systemic failures so interconnected that no single organ, no single system, no single generation could escape the damage once the ratchet started turning. The jaw was just the part you could see. Subscribe for more stories like this.